Hi everyone, I'm number one Marmaduke fan. In this video, I will be discussing and asking questions about Estelle B. Freedman's lecture series, Feminism and the Future of Women, published by Recorded Books. Of course, I strongly encourage you to listen to the original, whether on CD or a service like Audible. But I've written this video to provide enough context for you to understand what Estelle Freedman is talking about without having to immediately listen to the original lecture. I hope you'll find my video and questions helpful for thinking about these topics, even if you haven't yet listened to Freedman in her own words. This is not a thorough discussion. I'm not going to be making a feminism wrecked video where I do extensive research to dismantle her argument point by point. This is more of a general overview where I will summarize what I've learned about the feminist perspective from Freedman, but also add my perspective on what I've heard, identifying what I think are weak points of her argument or critical questions I have for the future. This is not in-depth. Though if you have thoughts that would push this conversation deeper, I'd encourage you to comment on this video as I plan to continue reading deeper on the topic of feminism. For now, we are just going to skim the surface. My original plan was to summarize all of our lectures in one video, but as it happened, I kept identifying quotes which were so loaded, they kept prompting questions I thought would be worth sharing. Because of that, this video is going to focus on Freedman's second lecture, Before Feminism, Explaining Gender and Power. On the CD audiobook, this lecture is included on Disc 2. To begin, Freedman defines patriarchy as the rule of husbands and fathers and suggests that male authority in the household is rooted in historical arguments over natural male superiority or male dominance. She argues that both supernatural theories and natural scientific theories prevented people from questioning gender hierarchy for millennia. Freedman agrees that for all of recorded history, sexual division of labor is universal and values men over women. I ask, how, why, and in what way? Freedman argues that son preference over daughters is an example of this male privilege. Well, does son preference prove something about universal patriarchy, or does it only prove that there may be an economic advantage for people living an agrarian lifestyle to have a boy who can do backbreaking labor? Freedman frames son preference as a matter of prestige and power. Sons bring prestige and power to their families, while daughters are merely married off, in Freedman's view. Again, as a feminist, Freedman is intimately concerned with power dynamics, not just in governments and cultures, but in families, and she assumes that near universal acceptance of fathers as family authorities means that boys are privileged over girls. I want to interject that the economic value of a boy to a poor family for most of human history was his capacity to do physical labor. If a boy can't do back-breaking work, if he can't fight to defend his homeland from invaders or die trying, if he can't utilize his brain power to solve problems, boys aren't born with an innate economic capital or privileged card just for being born boys. I think taking contemporary language about political power, like privilege, which might make sense in an American context, and projecting it backwards throughout human history is an anachronism. For example, a family planting rice in ancient China wouldn't be able to make sense of 21st century American politics. I think Freedman has acknowledged this in her first lecture when she suggested that the wage labor system essentially enabled feminism to exist. But I want to make the connection clear. Without capitalism, without economic growth bringing more wealth into existence for people to enjoy, feminism would seem like a bizarre, incomprehensible dilemma. Who cares about a supposed wage labor gap if you are struggling to grow food to survive the winter? The point I'm trying to make is that even though Freedman acknowledges this as a historical reality, her argument fails to consider why human societies prior to the 1800s might have had father-led households and why such an arrangement does not translate to privilege as we would understand it in a 21st century context. To illustrate, let's apply my counterpoint to Freedman's next point. As an illustration of gender asymmetry privileging men, she says that for much of human history, boys had more food provided to them than girls. But if the son is expected to go till the fields with his father and his sister is not, it makes sense that their food proportions would differ. Heavy physical labor requires a higher calorie count. If you ignore something like this, providing more food for boys than girls would seem like a case-closed example of male privilege. But with this consideration in mind, it becomes clear that the supposed male privilege comes with an assumption that you have to work for that extra food. There is an asymmetry in how labor is divided, which parallels the asymmetry in how food is divided. If Johnny and Sarah both get 3 biscuits, and Johnny's chores includes hauling bales of hay, and Sarah's chores include sewing, then they have not been fed equally, even though they have had the same number of biscuits. In fact, it's even possible that if Johnny has 4 biscuits and Sarah has 2, Johnny will still be more hungry at the end of the day than Sarah. Now, if Sarah does participate in hauling the bales of hay, then Sarah will need more biscuits and calories too. My point is that food division, all by itself, proves nothing about gender privilege if we don't know how the labor is divided as well. For an example of male power, Freedman points to religious systems which allow only men to hold positions in the clergy. Can women ever achieve sexual symmetry, she asks? According to Freedman, a religious belief which she thinks has led to only men becoming part of the clergy would be, in her words, only men can hear the word of God. Now, she could be talking about Jewish rabbis, she could be talking about Muslim imams, but by speaking broadly about religion, without defining the religious belief she's talking about, I think Freedman is trying to get away with an obnoxious statement. What Christian doctrine says that only men can hear the word of God? If she spoke about a specific religion, she would have to point to a specific religious doctrine which teaches male superiority. But then she would also have to deal with each religion's specific teachings on male and female. And at least with respect to Christianity, the notion that men become clergy because only men can hear the word of God isn't just off the mark, it's laughable. It's an assertion that can only survive if you do not ask the question, what biblical texts account for the vast majority of Christian pastors being men? Why are they there? What do they say? As far as I'm concerned, Freedman isn't so much trying to provide her students with profound insight on gender asymmetry in religious history, as she is trying to give her students a talking point to reinforce a feminist critique of religious institutions as power structures. Freedman can only get away with it by trying to speak of religion in the most generalized terms. I think that's her rhetorical purpose. What explains gender asymmetry? Asks Freedman. Why does it exist in the first place? Is sexual asymmetry something that can be changed or something that can't be changed? Freedman suggests that essentialist theories of gender leave little room for change. Essentialist theories are ones which emphasize gender difference as essential. These could be supernatural or religious in origin, such as polytheistic myths or the creation account in Genesis, or naturalistic, like Greek philosophy and medicine, or Darwinian theory. Freedman suggests that feminism has critiqued these evolutionary theories as bioreductionist, reducing male and female to mere biology. Here is my personal observation. If a feminist is anti-essentialist, that means she has to pick a fight with most of the world religions and Darwinian evolution. I see the trend of the rationalist skeptic community or YouTube atheists applying their time and energy to critiquing feminism to be a reflection of this reality. The atheism plus split had to happen because anti-essentialist feminists are 180 degrees opposite evolutionary theorists, and they actually lump them into the same category as traditional religions when it comes to the nature of gender. It makes for strange bedfellows. To illustrate a feminist critique, Freedman makes an allusion to bonobo behavior. She says that bonobos have been observed using sexual activity with multiple partners and genders as a form of social interaction. So instead of 2 males fighting each other for a mate, the bonobo males might mate with each other and the girl. Freedman asks coyly why this might not have been the model for human society, and this illustration struck me for a couple of reasons. First, in terms of simple sexual decency, Freedman is essentially pointing to Bonobo orgies as a model for how conflict might be resolved in human culture without violent, aggressive male behavior. Second, even if we were to grant her point and take any moral questions about Bonobo orgies off the table, which I'm not willing to do, I don't see what this point is supposed to say to secular biologists. Even if you think that bonobo orgies are worth looking at as an example of how to improve human society, wouldn't the fact that human beings don't behave like bonobos prove the whole point the evolutionary biologists are trying to make? The very point Freedman says feminists have critiqued? You could say that black widows are model feminists because they eat their male mates, but that's not an argument that human society could realistically have evolved into a more egalitarian society if we only followed black widow behavior. I really encourage you to go listen to Professor Freedman try to make this point, because you can hear the amusement in her voice as she describes bonobo orgy behavior, as if what she's saying is some sort of profound critique of scientific theory. Pretty much what I'm learning is that the tendency for feminists to say bizarre things with stridency isn't just a tendency of 20-something students fresh out of their first gender studies class. It's not just a matter of low-hanging fruit. The professors also have a tendency to say things that sound pretty ridiculous to anyone capable of taking off the feminist lenses to examine what has just been said. Why, oh why, can't humankind have orgies bonobo style already? That'd sure screw over the patriarchy, wouldn't it? But to be fair to Freedman, what she is trying to illustrate by pointing to insect and bonobo behavior is the idea that not every single animal is an example of males being physically or socially dominant over females in the species. But her own lecture on the near universality of males dominating human civilization seems to be a refutation of her larger point. You, an idiot, says, "So what if spiders don't have patriarchy? We aren't spiders." Me, an enlightened intellectual, responds, "Social constructionism." Freedman offers us another continuum. On one side is essentialism, and on the other side is social constructionism. Everything about us is the way it is because of culture. I think she is correct that human beings have a capacity to create culture that is categorically different from any animal. She suggests that social constructionism would be more important than any argument about biology or the origin of man when it concerns feminism. She suggests that aversion to menstrual blood is an example of a biological difference between men and women, creating a cultural difference, suggesting that male aversion to female blood and female sexuality helped create the Jewish religious strictures on menstruating women in the Torah. Like before, I think Freedman is projecting ideas onto men. If someone has an aversion to period blood, is it because they have a phobia of women and female sexuality? Or could it be more likely that they associate exposure to blood with germs? This is where feminist period blood art comes from. If you assume that aversion to blood is sexist, it makes sense to, as Gavin McGinnis has joked, put a tampon in a teacup as your art project. And as far as I'm concerned, Gavin's joke is downright tame compared to what I've seen in postmodern and feminist art. Like before, Freedman fails to consider other possibilities while assuming male privilege and male sexism. Maybe blood is gross, regardless of where it comes from. You tell me, feminists, what's your reaction when you're on the bus and the man next to you starts having profuse nosebleeding? Freedman suggests that other cultures exist where women's periods are actually celebrated, sort of as a fertility symbol. Even though she claims there is nothing right or wrong to these different cultures' views of menstruation, it's clear from the content of her lecture that she sees an essentialist theory, whether we're talking a religious one or a scientific one, as contributing to the oppression of women and the empowerment of men. She suggests that there can be a fuzzy space between essentialist theories and constructionist theories in fields like Freudian psychology. The idea is we learn behaviors as children, but they are so deeply learned that they cannot be unlearned. But Freedman also critiques Freud, using the argument that not every culture exhibits the same behavior of European families in Freud's culture. Freedman moves from the fuzzy space to the other end of the spectrum. Different constructionist theories. What are different constructionist theories, you ask? Some are more focused on individuals, whereas others are more focused on societies. Little picture, big picture. I've made this point in the past, but I want to quote Freedman to emphasize this point. Talking about the use of pink as a girl's color and blue as a boy's color, Freedman says, "Those things are changeable. How you raise children, whether you dress them in pink and blue and then say blue is more important." This tendency recurs throughout her lectures, and this is a nice illustration of it. Who says that blue is more important than pink? Freedman does. At any point she identifies a cultural distinction between boys and girls, Freedman assumes that culture values boys over girls, including when she talks about pink and blue as symbolic colors. There is no substantiation. This is how she thinks on a foundational level. To use terms that a feminist would appreciate, in Freedman's feminist dialectic, boys are always assumed to have privilege as a given. This isn't merely an assumption in her logic. I think it's an unquestionable presupposition for her entire feminist framework. To question this presupposition is to undermine the entire tenor and purpose of her lecture, and it comes across even in her casual illustrations. In contrast to these more individual-focused constructionist theories, which come from the field of sociology, there are also structural constructionist theories. Stay with me, guys. Structural constructionist theories emphasize the big picture more than the little picture. If little Johnny and little Susie in the toy aisle is the little picture focused on individuals, then the big picture is more like looking at all of the Johnnies and Susies across history, looking at whole governments, whole countries, whole religious institutions, things that span centuries. Now, history is Freedman's field, and I have to admit, it's much more interesting listening to her talk about history than it was listening to her try to talk about religion and evolutionary theory, topics she was clearly only interested in as far as they were relevant to the history of feminism. She offers a simple illustration of different historical perspectives, the bad old days theory and the good old days theory. She calls modernization theory the bad old days theory because it emphasizes all the terrible circumstances of the past, the caveman dragging the woman by the hair to his cave to have a gay old time. Modernization and technology is what liberates women from these circumstances. She calls this the progressive theory of history. The idea is everything's always getting better and better. As a counterpoint to this progressive theory of history, Freedman suggests that Western societies and colonialism made things worse for women in the primitive societies the West came into contact with. I'm going to use my own illustration here. If you're an American Indian suffering from smallpox, you might look back on the good old days before the white man came. It's just too bad they didn't build a wall when they had the chance. So, in contrast, the good old days perspective will try and argue that women were much happier before Western civilization arrived with its technology and Christianity to mess everything up. And Freedman identifies this good old day perspective as finding its origin in socialist and feminist writings. Do not let anyone shame you for talking about the problem of Marxism in American universities. If they think that Marxist theory in American higher learning is a right-wing fantasy, here is data point number 2 billion that, of course, Marxist theory is emphasized in American universities. It is Freedman, not me, who is identifying this field of feminist literature with socialism and Friedrich Engels. To her credit, I don't think that Freedman is entirely in the Marxist feminist camp herself, given what she has said prior about the wage labor economic system being a critical factor to the rise of feminism in history. But she is still putting forward the good old days theory as at least a valid critique of the bad old days or Western understanding of history. Freedman cites feminist historian Gerda Lerner as a contrast to Friedrich Engels. In Engels' view, private property rights came along and messed up everything for women. But in Lerner's view, it was the oppression of women that created the circumstances for capitalism to come into existence, when people stopped wandering around the fields and started settling down and developing agricultural societies. Again, Freedman's feminist lens leads her to miss really obvious things that might be readily apparent to anyone who is at least slightly skeptical of her broader argument. What is an illustration of how women were oppressed and enslaved by the invention of farming? Quote, women's reproductive labor had to, in a sense, be captured to bear those children who would become those laborers, and Lerner sees control over women's reproductive labor as the beginning of all kinds of social inequality. And essentially, women were the first slaves, in war as captives, and they would bear the children who would be the soldiers or the workers. Excuse me, Professor Freedman, I have a question. You say that the children would be the soldiers and the workers? Which children would be the soldiers now? The little girls? Oh, the boys. The boys would be the soldiers. Okay. Say, you said that women would be the first captives of war so they could bear children. So what exactly would happen to the boys at the villages that got raised, since they couldn't bear children? If, for the briefest of seconds, you imagined young boys either being murdered by wild barbarians or being forced to the front lines as soldiers, congratulations, you are a misogynist who needs to educate yourself on the oppression of women. Now, despite their differences, both Engels and Lerner are good old days socialist feminists. Freedman critiques their theories for ignoring other forms of hierarchy. Some women, like queens, might have privilege over some men. An excellent observation, Professor Freedman, but it is still assumed that the oppression of women as a group is the sole reality. Essentially, Freedman's objection to Engels and Lerner is that Freedman doesn't think every single woman, as an individual, was victimized. Freedman identifies female power as a form of resistance to patriarchy. She doesn't correct Lerner on the hordes of dead boys who seem to have mysteriously disappeared in the feminist dialectic on the oppression of women. The correction to the Marxist feminist theory that Freedman thinks of as key is how women used various strategies to resist patriarchy. Personally, I'm seeing a strong connection here between the language feminists like Freedman used to describe the history of patriarchy and the language used to describe the resistance in Star Wars or resistance to the Donald Trump administration, #resist. People labeling themselves as a resistance, whether or not they've ever picked up a book on history or feminist theory, see themselves as part of a historical struggle against a fuzzy form of systematic evil, whether that's Republicans or patriarchy or the bourgeois. Freedman argues that if there is a historical beginning to patriarchy, there can be a historical end to patriarchy, even if the questions about human origins can never be definitively answered. I want to underscore this. Freedman is dismissing the biological argument from before. Do you want to debate evolutionary theory with her? Well, her position is that because patriarchy came into existence in history, it therefore can be ended. There isn't a biological factor which will prevent feminist theory from working in the real world. The feminist utopia is at least possible. When Freedman distinguishes her view from the Marxist view of history, she does not reject the Marxist theory, but rather amends it to emphasize female empowerment as a way of resisting patriarchy. Sure, Freedman may recognize that capitalism has created a way of life for women that no sane woman would trade for a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in prehistoric ages, but Freedman essentially grants Marxist feminism's presuppositions about the oppression of women and posits the idea that we can fundamentally transform society along the lines of a feminist vision. The rest of her lecture is devoted to how women achieved political power and rights through economic production and how Western technology might rob them of their economic power by replacing their work with machine labor. I don't find this whole section particularly fascinating compared to what I think are the key foundational issues touched on earlier in this lecture. If we can't agree on whether the Stone Age was a better time or a worse time for a woman to be alive, we aren't going to be able to agree on the effect of new technology on African agricultural societies. No matter what topic she talks about, whether it's Chinese economic disputes or the effect of Catholic convents on patriarchal marriage, Freedman is consistently interested in using the feminist lens to examine these topics as issues of gender power hierarchy. The whole idea of using theory as a lens is it's supposed to show you something you can't see otherwise. A person with bad eyesight needs thick lens glasses to be able to bring things into focus. But unfortunately for Freedman's lecture series, I don't think her lenses bring things into focus so much as they obscure blatant observations that would deflate the Marxist feminist narrative of the good old days, back when men would chase wild animals with sharpened sticks to avoid starving to death because they were privileged or something. Boy, I just can't wait to talk about women's power strategies in future lectures. I see both Gamergate and the subsequent I see both Gamergate I see both you, an idiot. So what if spiders don't have patriarchy? We aren't spiders. Me, an enlightened intellectual, responds social are see. Do you want to debate